Welcome to Personal Injury Claims Explained by Foyle Legal, your trusted source for personal injury claims in Western Australia. Each week, we simplify complex legal issues, from motor vehicle accidents to workplace injuries, so you can confidently navigate your rights and secure the compensation you deserve.
Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Now, today we're diving into something that I think is super relevant to a lot of our listeners. And particularly if you happen to be, a guy between 25 and 44 and work in a job where you got to use your muscles here in WA. We're talking workplace injury claims.
Yeah, that's right. We're really going to focus on how what might seem like a pretty minor workplace incident can actually turn into a really major disruption to your life, all because of this thing called employer negligence. And especially when it comes to like manual handling tasks.
You know, we've got some really interesting legal documents to dissect today from a WA case actually back in 2018. Plus, got some great insights from Foyle Legal. They're a Perth firm that specializes in personal injury law. So we're hoping this deep dive kind of equips you guys with the knowledge you need to, first of all, hopefully avoid a workplace injury nightmare, but also to know what to do if the worst does happen.
Yeah, exactly. Like we always say, knowledge is power, and it's definitely true when it comes to, these kind of situations.
All right, so let's get into it. Let's jump right into this 2018 case. It's officially known as 2018 WADC 17, and it involves this machine operator. We'll just call him JW to keep things simple. He was working for a steel fabrication company, and he was only 32 at the time. So it just goes to show, this stuff can happen to anyone, really.
Yeah, for sure. So JW was operating this pretty heavy duty steel bending machine. They called it a Robo 45. And, this machine was supposed to be automated, but it seems like when they were bending these shorter steel bars, JW was actually having to manually lift out these like bundles of bars, and each bundle could weigh up to 20 kilos.
Wait, 20 kilos? That's got to be so heavy, especially if you're doing it like repeatedly all day long.
Yeah, it's definitely not light. And that's where things went wrong. JW ended up with a really serious back injury while he was lifting one of these bundles.
Okay, so I'm guessing that's where the whole employer negligence thing comes into play, right?
Yeah, you got it. See, the judge in this case basically concluded that the employer either knew or should have known that their workers were manually lifting these super heavy bundles. And it's like their responsibility to provide a safe system of work, And that includes having the proper equipment and giving workers proper training, especially when it comes to tasks that involve, a lot of heavy lifting.
So it's not a good enough excuse to say, well, everyone's doing it this way. It's still the employer's responsibility to make sure it's done safely right. That's a pretty important takeaway, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And here's where it gets even more interesting. And this is something that Foyle Legal really emphasizes in their blog, too. Turns out JW actually had this underlying spinal condition, and he wasn't even aware of. And so when he injured himself lifting those bundles, it basically like aggravated this existing condition,
right,
which then led to, a whole bunch of really serious back problems.
Wow. So what might have been just like, a minor strain for someone else turned into like a life-changing injury for JW because of this thing he didn't even know he had.
Exactly. And that's why Foyle Legal is, really big on people, especially those in physically demanding jobs, getting regular checkups with their doctor. You just never know if you might have an underlying issue that could make a seemingly minor injury way worse.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It kind of makes you realize how important it is to really know your body and listen to what it's telling you.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously this injury had a massive impact on JW's life.
Yeah.
And he ended up taking his employer to court. What happened with that?
Well, the judge ultimately ruled in JW's favor. And get this, he was awarded $1.39 million in damages, which is a lot of money. This was a pretty landmark case because it really clearly established that the employer was negligent in not providing that safe system of work we talked about.
So that's a huge win for JW for sure. But $1.39 million, what does that actually cover in a case like this? Like, what does that money represent?
That's where understanding the different types of damages you can actually claim becomes super important. And Foyle Legal, they actually do a great job of breaking all this down in their blog. So basically in JW's case, those damages would have included things like all his medical expenses. So, stuff like surgeries, rehab, ongoing treatment. And then, of course, there's lost income, both like what he's already missed out on and what he'll miss out on in the future.
Right. Because if you can't work because of an injury you got at work, you should be compensated for the money you would have earned.
Right, exactly. And it's not just about, the wages you've already lost, but also your like future earning capacity. So if because of the injury, you can't work in the same field or at the same level you were before, you can actually claim damages for that potential loss of income as well.
So this case is a good example of why it's important to know what your rights are as a worker.
Right.
And that you can actually claim for different types of damages if you're injured because your employer was negligent.
Absolutely. And it also shows how important it is to, get expert legal advice early on, because navigating these claims can be super complicated. And having someone like Foyle Legal in your corner can really make a big difference in the outcome. They know the law inside out and can help you gather the right evidence and build a strong case so you can get the compensation you deserve.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like JW's case is a wake-up call for anyone who works in a job where they have to push their body to the limit.
Yeah.
What are some of the most important takeaways for our listeners who might be in similar situations?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that employers have a legal obligation to provide a safe system of work. So that means they need to identify potential hazards, figure out how risky they are, and then actually implement measures to control those risks. It's not just about having like a bunch of safety guidelines written down somewhere. They actually have to be put into practice.
Right. So it's not just about having the rule book, but making sure that those rules are followed and that workers are actually protected.
Exactly. And for workers, it's crucial to understand that you have rights. If you think something's not safe at work, you have a right to speak up. Don't be afraid to, raise your concerns with your supervisor or your safety rep. And if you get injured, report it right away and go see a doctor.
And I'm guessing documenting everything's really important too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Keep track of dates, times, what tasks you were doing, names of any witnesses, anything that you think could be relevant later on. And like we've been saying, getting legal advice early can make all the difference in navigating this whole process and getting a fair outcome in the end. What's really interesting about this whole case with JW is it kind of shines a light on this whole concept of a safe system of work, which is, way more than just like putting up a few safety posters around the workplace, right? It's got to be like a proactive and holistic approach to actually preventing these injuries from happening in the first place.
Okay, so like in a practical sense, what would that actually look like? Like if we're talking about a situation like JW's, what could the employer have done differently to actually make sure that was a safe system of work?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, the employer should have really looked at, whether that Robo 45 machine was even the right tool for the job, for bending those shorter steel bars. I mean, like if the automated system wasn't really designed for that, maybe they should have provided different equipment altogether, like some kind of lifting aid or, maybe implemented like a buddy system where workers could help each other out with the heavy lifting.
Right. So it's about those extra steps to make sure that, even the stuff that seems routine is being done safely. It's not just about, cutting corners or expecting workers to just tough it out and lift with their backs all the time.
Exactly. And the judge actually made a point of saying this in his ruling, that the employer didn't do a good enough job of assessing the risks of manually lifting those heavy bundles. And that kind of sends a pretty strong message to other employers that you can't just ignore potential hazards, even if it's something that everyone's been doing for ages.
That actually brings up a question I've always wondered about. Like, what happens if a worker does get injured, but it turns out they weren't following safety procedures? Does that automatically mean they can't claim compensation?
Well, not necessarily. It's usually not that black and white, The law recognizes that sometimes workers make mistakes, or maybe they feel pressured to cut corners or whatever. So the key is to kind of figure out, how much the worker's actions actually contributed to the injury, if at all.
So it's more about like the degree of responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to have like a really experienced legal professional on your side, because they can look at all the details, gather the right evidence, and present your case in the best possible light. You know what I mean?
Because I imagine it's pretty easy to feel lost and overwhelmed if you get injured at work. It's already a stressful situation.
Right.
And then you've got to deal with all this legal stuff on top of it.
Oh, totally. That's why Foyle Legal really pushes the whole, get legal advice as soon as possible after the injury thing. They can walk you through everything, explain your rights, and help you make good decisions.
It's like having a guide in your corner who really understands the system and who can actually fight for you.
Exactly. And they can also help you understand like the full extent of the damages that you might be entitled to, because a lot of people don't realize it goes way beyond just, medical bills and lost wages.
Okay, so let's talk about those damages. Like, what else can you claim for in a workplace injury case?
Well, yeah. So on top of those essential medical costs and the income you've already lost, you can actually also claim for stuff like future loss of earnings, which is super important. If the injury leaves you with a disability, that means you can't work in the same field anymore, or, maybe not at the same level you're working at before.
Yeah, that makes sense because your ability to earn a living has been impacted, and
Yeah.
that needs to be taken into account.
Exactly. And then there are also damages for things that are kind of harder to measure, but are still really important, like pain and suffering, loss of enjoyment of life, even like the cost of care if your injury means you need help with everyday stuff.
So it really is about looking at the whole picture, how the injury has affected your life physically,
Yeah.
but also emotionally and everything.
Exactly. And it's also worth remembering that even if the injury seems minor at first, sometimes those things can have long-term consequences that you don't realize right away. So that's why it's super important to see a doctor right away and document everything.
Okay, speaking of document, what exactly should people be writing down if they get injured at work? Like, what's the most important stuff?
Well, Foyle Legal has this really good list in their blog. But basically, you want to record the date and time of the incident, obviously, and then like a really detailed description of exactly what happened. What tasks were you doing? Were there any witnesses? And make sure you write down, any pain or symptoms you're experiencing. And then keep track of all your medical appointments, treatments, any communication you have with your employer about the injury, all that kind of stuff.
Well, that's a lot to remember when you're probably freaking out. It's probably a good idea to just get in the habit of documenting things as they happen, just in case you're right.
You got it. It's way easier to have those records on hand than to try and remember everything later on.
Okay, so we've talked about those safe systems of work and the different types of damages you can claim, why it's so important to document everything, and why you should get legal help ASAP. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about workplace injury claims that you come across?
Oh man, there are so many. But I think one of the most common ones is that you need to have some kind of catastrophic injury to make a claim. Like, you were paralyzed or something. But the truth is, any injury that stops you from working or needs medical treatment could be grounds for compensation.
So even something that seems relatively minor at first, like, a sprain or a strain, could be worth pursuing.
Yeah, for sure. And another one I hear all the time is that if you make a claim, you're going to get fired. But that's simply not true. It's actually illegal for an employer to retaliate against you for making a legitimate workplace injury claim.
That's good to know. It's important that people feel like they can actually stand up for their rights without being afraid of losing their jobs.
Absolutely. Your health and well-being are way more important than any job. And you deserve to be compensated if you've been hurt because your employer wasn't careful enough.
Well said. I feel like there's a theme emerging here, and it's that knowledge is power, understanding your rights, being proactive, and getting expert help can really make all the difference.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about taking control of the situation and making sure you get the support and the compensation you deserve.
Now, you mentioned earlier that employers can't get back at you for making a claim. But what happens if the worker was kind of partially responsible for their injury? Like they did something dumb. Does that mean they can't claim anything?
That's a great question. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with, the whole contributory negligence thing. Basically, it doesn't mean you're automatically disqualified from making a claim just because you might have messed up or, contributed to the injury in some way.
So even if the worker was partly to blame, they might still be able to get some compensation.
Yep. It all comes down to figuring out how much each side was at fault and then coming up with a fair outcome.
This whole conversation's really got me thinking about workplace safety in a bigger sense. Like, it's not just about avoiding legal trouble. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe and like their well-being actually matters.
I agree. It's about that shared responsibility, where everyone's involved in making the workplace safe and healthy.
And that goes way beyond just, ticking boxes and following the rules. It's got to be about genuinely caring about people and wanting them to be okay.
Exactly. When safety is like really a part of the culture, everyone benefits.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. And I think there's a lot in here for our listeners, especially those guys out there doing those tough physical jobs.
Yeah, it's been a good discussion.
Before we wrap things up for this part of the deep dive, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about something that I think often gets overlooked, which is the psychological impact of workplace injuries.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like we tend to focus so much on the physical injuries, but the mental and emotional side of it can be just as bad, if not worse sometimes.
It's not just about the broken bones and, the sprains and stuff. It's also about the stress, the anxiety, maybe the fear that you won't be able to provide for your family anymore. All that uncertainty about the future.
Exactly. Like a workplace injury can really mess with your whole sense of, identity and security. And if it's a really serious injury, we're talking like depression, PTSD, even relationship problems can happen because of the strain.
It's like this ripple effect that just kind of spreads out, touches every part of your life.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to, really acknowledge and address the psychological side of things as well.
Okay, so what can be done to actually help those workers who are going through all that emotional stuff after a workplace injury?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about creating a workplace culture where mental health is taken just as seriously as physical health. So that means things like encouraging people to talk openly about it, providing access to counseling services, and just generally, fostering that supportive environment where people feel okay about asking for help.
So it's kind of like that whole holistic approach to safety again, taking care of the whole person, not just their body.
Absolutely. And if you're a worker who's been injured, don't be afraid to, reach out for support, talk to your doctor, a therapist, maybe a support group, even just a friend or family member you trust. There's no shame in asking for help, and it can make a huge difference in how well you recover.
It's about recognizing that, healing isn't just a physical thing, it's emotional too.
Exactly. And remember, there are heaps of resources out there to help you through it all. Organizations like Beyond Blue and Lifeline are amazing. And of course, Foyle Legal can help you with the legal side of things, which can take a lot of the stress and worry off your plate.
Man, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I think it's shown us all, just how complicated these workplace injury claims can be, especially here in WA. It's not just about knowing your rights. It's about understanding all the other stuff that comes with it, the physical, the emotional, the financial impact that an injury can have.
I think you said it perfectly. It's about empowering yourself with knowledge, being proactive and reaching out to the experts when you need help.
So for our listeners out there, what's the one thing you want them to remember from this whole conversation?
If you're working a job that's really physically demanding, especially if you're a guy between 25 and 44, because statistically, you guys are most at risk of getting injured at work. Just take your safety seriously. Don't cut corners. Listen to your body and speak up if something doesn't feel right.
And if the worst does happen and you do get injured, remember, you don't have to go through it alone.
There's help out there. Legal experts like the team at Foyle Legal can walk you through the whole process. And there are support networks that can help you deal with all the challenges that come with it.
This has been such a great conversation. Really insightful. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure. It's been great to be here.
And all our listeners out there, stay safe, know your rights, and never underestimate the power of getting some expert advice when you need it.
Thanks for tuning in to Personal Injury Claims, explained by Foyle Legal. Remember, this podcast is for informational purposes and isn't legal advice. For advice specific to your situation, visit us at Foyle Legal. And don't forget to subscribe or leave a review.